Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
There we go. Thank you for attending our very first public comment meeting on the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. I have two people from NW Financial. I don't know why I always want to say Northwestern. You guys are not affiliated with them, correct?
Not at all.
Okay.
We have green logos, just like they do.
Oh, maybe that's what it is. But NW Financial Group is going to speak and explain to us and answer your questions as to what you can and cannot do with this wonderful blessing that the President of the United States and federal government, yeah, we're going to have to turn the cell phones on to silence or vibration. And if you need to speak, you can just step out the room so the meeting can continue. But to acknowledge a few people in the audience, our wonderful Mayor, Wanda R.D. Williams, is here. A few of our city council members are here. Council President Danielle Bowers, Dave Mattson, and way in the back, Mr. Ralph Rodriguez. So, without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Julie Needham and Mr. Thomas Beckett. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Julie Needham of NW, and
I'm Tom Beckett from NW Group.
and first of all, we'd like to thank the mayor and the council and the city for having us here, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts and your questions on this. Tom is going to start by giving you some background information on the American Rescue Plan Act and some of its objectives, and then I'm going to go through some of the categories of the eligible use and some examples, and then we'll listen to your questions and your thoughts. So, first of all, did anyone not get a presentation? We have copies here. Okay? Perfect? Tom.
All right. Thank you, Julie. And again, I'd like to say it's a pleasure to be here tonight, and I thank the mayor and the members of council for kind of the confidence they placed in our firm to help you and listen and be a resource for the mayor and the city of Harrisburg, and kind of going through the ins and outs of this American Recovery Plan. As everybody probably knows, we've been in a pandemic for the last 2 years, and as part of that pandemic, the federal government has done. As part of the pandemic response, the federal government has done a couple of rounds of stimulus and recovery funding. This bill was passed in March of last year, and it created $1.9 trillion worth of stimulus money that came from the federal government to all through the economy and the communities in the United States. We're talking specifically tonight about what's called the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, or SLRF. And that's $350 billion that's been allocated out and designated to each community in this country. And Harrisburg's share of that is $47 million. What do you do with $47 million? I think everybody could figure out what they want to do with $47 million, but the feds have put a little bit of restrictions on what we need to do with that. And those restrictions are contained in what's called the final rule. And the final rule is 437 pages long. And what we do, and what we've been doing since middle of last year, and primarily Julie, she's our resident expert on this, is sifting through those 437 pages on behalf of our clients and kind of giving them advice on how their plans can fit within the guidelines of that final rule. That is our job here, and is to help the city of Harrisburg and its representatives sift through those guidelines to determine what you can and what you want to do with $47 million. The key objectives of the Fiscal Recovery Plan are fourfold. Maintaining the levels of public service. There have been tremendous tremendous efforts on behalf of all of the people who work in government throughout these past 2 years to keep things going. And the federal government has said, let's do that. Let's replace revenue that was lost during the pandemic. So that's maintaining public services. Obviously, fighting the pandemic. There's a lot of money in the ARP program to do that. In other words, public health measures, PPE, and things like that. I think the most relevant two pieces of this for the city are providing support for families, businesses, and industries, and the adverse impacts and the disproportionate impacts to communities like Harrisburg that you've faced as a result of the pandemic. There's money for addressing those things. And lastly, but I think most importantly, is to be able to put investments back into communities that provide for long-term, sustainable, resilient growth, but that growth that is spread equitably. And that was a big emphasis of the American Recovery Plan, was the equitable recovery. So that's a general overview of kind of the policy, but as I said before, Julie is one of our resident experts in drilling down to the details, and I'll let her go over some of the examples of things that we've seen in other communities since we started working on the American Recovery Plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, so the eligible uses of this money, as Tom said, the big question is, so what can you do with the money? There are 4 categories of eligible uses. They are public sector revenues, public health and economic response, premium pay, and infrastructure. And I'm going to talk about each one of those in turn. So public sector revenues. The City of Harrisburg, like all recipients, is required to calculate its revenue loss that was due to the pandemic. And there's a whole lot of specific rules and a formula on how it has to do that. And up to the amount of that revenue loss, the city has wide latitude to use that portion of the money to provide general government services. Beyond the revenue loss, any eligible uses have to fit into one of the other 3 categories. The second category is public health and economic response. This is a big one, and we're going to go through this in some detail, and we'll probably circle back to it. Public health and economic response, there's 2 parts to that. In the public health portion of that is COVID mitigation, medical expenses, behavioral health care, responding to and preventing gun violence, and some capital expenditures. Examples in this category would include vaccination programs, payments to a hospital for COVID care, treatment for substance abuse, or a community police program to reduce gun violence. In addition, in this category is also responding to the negative economic impacts of the pandemic. This includes assistance to certain households or communities, assistance to unemployed workers, assistance to small businesses or nonprofits, and aid to impacted industries. So examples in this category, hi, welcome, would you like? Yeah, there you go. Thank you for coming. So examples in this category of responding to the negative economic impacts of the pandemic would include emergency housing assistance, neighborhood improvements, job training, tutoring programs, and grants to small businesses. One thing that's important to understand about these examples in this category as a whole is that there are restrictions on what type of people can receive these programs and what type of communities can receive them. And roughly it goes by income, but there's other ways to qualify or not qualify. And we can get into that more later. But I just wanted to be clear that in the public health and economic response, there's the public health part focusing on COVID mitigation, and there's the economic response focusing on responding to the negative economic impacts of the pandemic. The third big category is premium pay. The city could, if it wishes, have a premium pay program to provide essential workers who performed essential work with premium pay payments. There is a whole lot of details about who exactly would qualify and limitations on what those payments can be. And finally, the last category is infrastructure. One of the eligible uses is to make necessary investments in water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure. And examples in this category would include sewer repair, lead line replacement, green infrastructure, or water conservation programs. As Tom mentioned, the final rule is a very long document with many, many specifics in it. So these are some of the examples. There's others beyond that, but these are the categories. This is the way that the federal government has laid it out into sections, and eligible uses need to be specifically eligible in terms of the language in these sections. That was a lot of information. So I'm going to open it up to anyone who has questions or thoughts that they would like to share. Hi, good evening.
Good evening. So who actually makes the decisions on the final rule?
Well, the city of Harrisburg is going to decide how it wishes to spend the money that it's been allocated. We are a resource to advise the city whether or not a specific type of program is eligible or not eligible. The federal government will has said that it will be auditing some of the expenses that all of the recipients make. The city of Harrisburg, like all the recipients, is required to report to the Department of Treasury how it spent the money and what categories specifically those expenditures fall into. If those expenditures are not eligible, as determined by the Treasury Department in the future, the city might have to repay the money for those ineligible expenses.
But for the time being, they're basically trying to make a proposal for some funds to be used for some purpose. With your group's guidance as to whether or not it's eligible or not?
We are, yeah, correct. They can ask, you all can ask us questions and we can give our recommendation, is this or is this not eligible? But the decision of what is important to the city of Harrisburg, what do you need to spend the money on, what do you want to do with this is your decision. Your money, your decision, you will collectively decide how to do it. And you do not need to ask permission from the Department of Treasury. The city has already received half of its money. It will shortly receive the other half of its money. And there's no further permission. You don't have to go to the federal government and say, we're planning on doing COVID testing. Is that okay? You're going to look at what's eligible and say, okay, COVID testing, that's eligible. We want to do it. We think that's important. Let's do it.
But let me just make a specific example.
Sure.
Just as an example.
Yes, please.
Which you haven't specifically mentioned. Right?
Yes.
So let's say the city says, gee, one of the real problems that we've encountered because of COVID and then people are being unable to pay for rent, which continues to go up in
Yep.
so many places.
Yep.
You can't pay their mortgages, right? It's cascading effect, right? So what happens if we were to make a concerted effort in the city of Harrisburg to build truly low-income, affordable housing, right? Which we don't have enough of, right?
Yes.
So, is that something that then, if the city says, that's what we would like to do for some amount of that money, of the 47 million?
Yep.
Then, and we think that it falls into the category of public sector revenues, other infrastructure.
Yep.
Is that where, if we feel like, the city feels like that's.
So that is a great question. And let me get a little technical here to try to answer it specifically. So the money that's in the public health bucket, the public health and negative economic impacts, which is the category that housing, that rental assistance, mortgage assistance, low-income housing. So in that bucket of public health and negative economic impacts, the Treasury has said that there are 3 types of eligible beneficiaries, like people who can get the money. The first category is everybody. So for example, for vaccination programs or COVID testing, the city can give it to everybody, anywhere. So that's one slice. The next slice is what they call impacted households. And impacted households includes low and moderate income households. There's other ways to get into that bucket, but that's close enough to understand low and moderate income. So for example, you talked about rental assistance. Rental assistance is an eligible use of funds, but only to impacted households, meaning to people who are low or moderate income or have certain programs or whatever, but you can't give rental assistance to everybody. Does that make sense? And then the third slice that they've made is disproportionately impacted households and communities. And this is low income. There's other ways to get into this bucket, but low income basically is the way to think about it. So, for example, you can renovate abandoned buildings, or you can clean up empty lots, but only in disproportionately impacted communities, meaning low income. So the answer to your question about rent, let me start with rental assistance, because that one's actually very easy. The answer is rental assistance and mortgage assistance and utility assistance and assistance with trash pickup fees, for example. All of that is an eligible use, and it's an eligible use for impacted households. So you would have to check that the people receiving that help meet the criteria for low or moderate income. Yeah.
Is that lower moderate income based on the gross or the net income?
It's either median household income or federal poverty guidelines, or receiving services through certain enumerated types of programs. And there's a whole thing about that. So anyway, the question about building housing, the answer is yes. Low-income housing is an eligible use of funds. It has to meet requirements about addressing housing needs. It has to meet requirements regarding being a disproportionately impacted community, and there's other guidelines about capital expenditures. Meaning, if you take $10 million and you build a house, a big apartment building, right? That's different than services, like where you're doing COVID tests. So there's guidelines about capital expenditures, so the long answer is maybe. I mean, it's a category that the final rule discusses. Low-income housing is talked about in the guidance. So if the city decides that that's your priority and that's what you want to do, you would want to go through very carefully and be clear that the project that you're planning meets all of those specific requirements in terms of going about it. And let me circle back again to what I started with, which is that there's a lot of different ways to use this money. There's some ways you can't use this money, but there's a lot of ways you can use this money. And there's more ways to use the money than money that you have. So you're going to be picking and choosing what's important, what do you need, what do you want, and what do you need to save for the future. And that's the last part of this. This money can be used until 2024. well, it has to be obligated by then, but, okay. Can be used, so this, we're only in 2022 right now, right? You're not getting any more. This is it. You got what you got. It's going to, you can spend it until 2024. So you might think that today the most important thing to do is something. But then maybe, this pandemic doesn't go away. Maybe there's some bad news in the future. Maybe there's a variant. And maybe a year from now or 2 years from now, what you really need are more ambulances. So prudence dictates that you think about what do you need and want today, and what might you need and want in the next few years.
Regarding the 47 million,
Yeah.
half of it has been received. Has any of it been allocated? No. And is there requirements based on the 4 categories to be split 25%?
No.
You could do 50% in both?
No. The only except to that is the calculation of the revenue loss. You do need to calculate what your revenue loss is, but that revenue loss money, you then have extra freedom in how to spend it. It's a little bit less restricted than the rest of the money. So the only category requirement is you do need to know how much that was. But there's no requirement. You could spend the whole thing on PPE. PPE for everybody, gloves, hats, plastic things. We're going to spend $47 million on PPE. You would be allowed to do that. You literally are not required to spend any money on anything. If you don't spend it, eventually you have to give it back. That's a different problem, but. Yeah.
One other question. With the
Yeah.
premium paid for essential workers,
Yes.
that gets backdated? You can go back to when the pandemic started?
Yes.
And track, and that $13 extra, is that then taxed as earned income the year that it's declared?
I don't know how it's taxed, but the answer is yes. You can pay premium pay retroactively, backdated to the official start of the pandemic, which was January of 2020.
I would ask your tax or accountant for that, answer that question, not us. Or not accountants.
Yes. This gentleman is next.
Your examples are not exhaustive.
Correct.
But looking at the first category, capital, that's sort of the low-hanging fruit. But there's a whole category, subcategory under each topic that would not represent that easy to identify low-hanging fruit. What would be the effort to go out and examine those relative to Harrisburg? That's my first question. The second one is in terms of economic and health response and COVID mitigation. Largely, those efforts are behind us. We are at a point now where the numbers are coming down, the death rate is coming down, et cetera, et cetera. But the city of Harrisburg and everybody else has already expended millions upon billions of dollars. So again, to the question of to the extent this is retroactive, will you go back and seek to compensate people who have already run vaccination programs, organizations that have already done community outreach, et cetera, et cetera? I'll stop there for a moment.
So that's really 3 different questions, and let me take one at a time. So the first question that you raised was since we've only given a few examples here, how will the city and the officials know what else is possible? Is that a fair restatement? So there's a couple of different ways to get there. The Treasury Department has put out some summaries with lists of things you can use. So these are public documents. So there's a webinar, there's an overview. So to the extent, for example, that the city might be interested in focusing on responding to the negative economic impacts, you can you can pull up those summaries and say, oh, okay, that includes this and that and the other thing. Okay, those are some good ideas. We also can help. For example, one of the things we can provide, the final rule, the 437 pages, does not come with a table of contents. I have prepared a table of contents. I have it right over here. If you flip through it, you can see, oh, I see, look at that. This category and that category in there, mitigating climate change is inside the water infrastructure section, for example. So when you see those things, you can then get some ideas. Another way to do it is I've prepared lists of some of the specific things that were mentioned as eligible in the final rule, and of course would be glad to share that with everyone who's interested. And the last thing is you all could, in fact, sit there and read the 437 pages and, but that's what we're here to help you with. That's why the federal government has made summaries and lists and ideas. We have summaries and lists and ideas. There's webinars. The National League of Cities has webinars. The Association of Counties has these webinars. And people just talk to people, right? So, one CFO will talk to another CFO and find out what they're doing. It is actually a problem that there's so many good things you could do. How do you wrap your mind around it? So these are some ideas.
Another way to address that question, I'm sorry, me too. Another way to address that question would be, this is the only client or city that we're working with that has specifically said, we want to have community outreach sessions to listen to our community. So that's part of it. It is a big list of things that you can do. But your community is the one that has to make the decisions, has to do the deciding, and has to say, okay, is this something that we want to? Is this the most important set of things that we want to do? And we can help you navigate the regs, but it's the mayor told us in our first meeting, you got to come out, you got to listen, and that's what we're doing.
Yeah, and you could start with. And you can start with what's important to you and find out if it's an eligible use. So if what you really care about is math tutoring, you could ask the question, hey, what I really want for the city of Harrisburg is math tutoring. Can we use the money for it? Answer would be yes, by the way, but in certain communities. So you can start by where do I get ideas for how to help the city, or you can start with here's what we want to do, can we do it? Does that answer your first question? Okay. Your second question was, and I'm actually going to split it up into two parts. So the first thing you said is, we're pretty much done with COVID. We got all the vaccination, the tests, the PPE, we finished with that. Like, do we even need to think about public health anymore? So, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit because I want to make the point that the public health section has more than specific responses to COVID-19 in it. It includes all of that, testing, vaccination, medical expenses, it includes all of that. But it has other things too. It has behavioral health care. That means things like suicide hotlines, opioid outreach, syringe programs, a wide variety of health care. They call it behavioral health care. That's not specific to COVID-19, but in the federal government's mind is part of the important response to it. It also includes, the health category also includes responding to and preventing gun violence. So you could create community policing programs to address gun violence. You could have community anti-violence programs or programs in the schools to focus on the youth. You could have expenses related to tracking serial numbers on guns, for example. So that whole category is in the public health. And finally, there's some of the capital expenditures. You know, you talked, this lady over here was talking about low-income housing, but you also, if you wanted, could look at capital expenditures with respect to healthcare. So if you needed an expansion of a hospital, for example, that's potentially eligible. Again, everything I say is eligible means, and then you have to look at it really, really carefully. So I'm just gonna not say that every time I say it. But those kinds of things are all in the health category. And the last point you made was there were expenses going back that the city did last year, for example, to spend money on vaccination programs, right? So your question is, can you get that money back? Essentially, this is a big, you get this bucket of money, and here's your bucket of money, and now you're gonna decide what to do with it. But part of the point of calculating your revenue loss was that last year, you probably had all these expenses you don't normally have for vaccinations and testing and people working remotely and so on. So one of the points of that category of revenue loss is that the city needs to get its budget back in balance for the money it spent in the past. Exactly what you were talking about. Last year, you had all these expenses, so you drew down your reserves. That's what that revenue loss money is for. So it's not exactly like reimbursing because you're not writing a check to somebody else. Like if somebody else was doing COVID tests for you, you already paid them in the past. So you're not going to write a check to them now because they got paid in the past. But it came out of the city reserves, I assume. So that's what the revenue loss piece is about, is the federal government expects that you, like everybody else, got slammed in the pandemic. So you got to keep the city running. You got to keep the paychecks going. You got to make sure the streetlights stay on. So step one is that. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
So just procedurally,
Yeah.
are you all contracted with the city? Let me be very frank. Is your payment coming from the city? Is it coming out of this pot? Is it coming up from the federal government? When I say you.
No, I understand. NW Financial Group. Our fee is an eligible use of funds, and we expect that the city will be using its American Rescue funds to pay our fees.
Okay. I'll let that one go by.
And the city is our own fund.
You're fine. Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
So now, in this last category, water, sewer, broadband, and infrastructure, Capital Region Water has water and sewer here. And broadband infrastructure is, to my knowledge, really very privately owned, perhaps subsidized by the state. But my point is that whole category seems to be superfluous to Harrisburg. I could be wrong. But, or you go talk to Capital Region Water. But, assuming that we cut that category altogether, do we have the option of reallocating that money to other programs? In other words, if we didn't consider that at all, would the government be upset that we didn't take care of the Susquehanna River?
There's no
requirements for buckets.
Okay.
No requirements, exactly. I will point out that section of infrastructure has some of the other folks we've talked to have, for example, flooding in specific places in their cities that they want to address, and this is a good way to do that. So in other words, you don't have to necessarily be creating a whole water treatment plant with the money. You can replace culverts, for example, where there's flooding. There's also a whole climate mitigation section here. So for example, you can put in porous paving in parking lots and in roads. In general, you can't use this money for roads except to the extent of the revenue loss. But with a focus on climate change, you can put in porous pavements You can also put in green roofs, you can put in bioswales. Again, this doesn't have to be your priority, but if you all collectively wanted to do that, it's not just drinking water treatment plants. There's ways to tackle specific focused projects inside the infrastructure bucket.
But you bring up a very good point, which is Capital Region Water does the water and sewer. They have their own buckets. So I would ask myself if I were in the community's shoes or in the mayor's or the council member's shoes, is that where we should, would we ever deploy our money there? Because it's really somebody else's responsibility, and they probably have money for it.
Please.
So you touched on this briefly, but for clarification on the timeline, especially if a project or program is underway, you use the word obligated and spent. Could you clarify that by 2024?
Yeah, I was doing a little bit of shorthand there. So you must obligate the money by December 31st of 2024. Obligate means you've committed to spending that money. The actual deadline for spending it, for writing the check and the money goes out the door, is December 31st of 2026. So that's 2 years later. And in the final rule, they talk about that difference being particularly with an idea towards these big projects. If you're doing a dam renovation, for example, or building a water treatment plant, that those kinds of things take a very long time to actually get the project done. But the rules are the same for all the money. You must obligate it by the end of 2024 and expend it by the end of 2026.
How does this last category
Mhm.
overlap with the recently passed infrastructure?
There is some overlap, and there are things you can do from either of those buckets of money, and things that you can only do with the one or the other. But the infrastructure bill does not give a specific allocation to the city of Harrisburg. So there's money available for grants that you can apply for. There's money that goes to the state of Pennsylvania. But in this case, with the American Rescue Plan, it's your $47 million. So you don't now have to apply for it. You don't have to fight anybody else. You don't have to defend that your choice of how to spend the money is a good idea.
But we should probably think pretty carefully about which bucket of money we expect some of this work to come out of.
I agree. I think that's an excellent point and very thoughtful. Great question. I like it. All right, you cannot use the money to pay debt service. So money that you borrowed in the past, if you did a bond issue, for example, and you want to pay it off, you cannot use the money for that. You cannot use the money to settle lawsuits unless the lawsuit specifically requires you to do something which is an eligible use of these funds. You cannot... Pension payments, thank you very much, Tom. Good, yes. You cannot make lump sum pension payments. So those are some of the big ones. And then within these categories, there are restrictions on where you can and cannot use the money. So let me give you an example from one of our clients. They wanted to build and renovate a park. And building and renovating parks is inside the public health category, and it's specific to that disproportionately impacted community. I know, weird technical language. And so disproportionately impacted community has a meaning in the final rule. It's defined. And one of the ways you get to be a disproportionately impacted community the federal government has taken a map and drawn all these little areas, broken it all up into these little boxes called census tracts. And some of these are qualified census tract, which sort of means like low income. But literally there's a map with a picture on it, and it's in purple or it's not in purple. So the city of Harrisburg has 16 census tracts, 11 of which are qualified census tracts. So in those 11 census tracts, those are all definitely disproportionately impacted communities, and you could definitely build a park there. In the others, maybe yes, maybe no. There's a whole nother blah, blah, blah about could you do it or could you not. We had a client who wanted to build a park in in an area that was not a qualified census tract. Long story short, meaning kind of wealthy.
But it was right next to qualified census tract.
Yes. So we did, that's what they wanted to do, and they asked us, is it eligible? So we went through an analysis, and we ended up saying yes. But it wasn't a slam dunk. So there's no, you can't pay off bond issues with it. And there's yes, you can do COVID testing with it. And there's maybe, can I build a park in a non-qualified census tract? Maybe. So those are examples. Yeah.
So you're basing it on the 2020 census. Harrisburg is a ever-changing city, and what was a disproportionate area in 2020 may not be that today.
You are correct, and,
So
yeah,
what do you go by?
Yep.
2020 or by what it is now?
so a lot of the final rule, that's a great question, by the way. I like that question, because you're right. The neighborhoods change, people change, things change. So when you're talking about communities, whether they're disproportionately impacted or not, the final rule, the federal government says, go to this specific website and look at this specific map from from HUD, and is it in purple or not? Like right now, today. I actually have that map with me, if you care to look at it, for the city of Harrisburg. So you're right that map may be outdated. It might not fairly reflect whatever's happened since then. But it kind of is what it is. Like, is it yes or no purple on that map today on that specific website? You know what I'm saying? Like, there's kind of what's right in general, and then there's like, yes or no, this test, do you pass it? So it's so the answer is, if you're in a qualified census tract today, as of what's on HUD's website, then you're disproportionately impacted, and then you can definitely do all those things that are neighborhood features and safety, pedestrian safety and park renovations. That stuff is eligible for disproportionately impacted communities. For individuals, for households, there's different guidance about if you're going to give food assistance, for example, which is for impacted households, you would need to look at people's income statements. And again, that's going to be different 2 years from now than from today. But that's how they set it up. That you can't give food assistance to everybody, just to impacted households, which might change. Yeah.
On the first page after the intro,
Yep.
the last section, you mentioned equitable recovery.
Right.
So how do you wrestle with the problem of equitable? Let me give you an example. With the American Rescue Plan, with the infrastructure plan, that scene is benefiting communities across the country. However, when you come down to the nuts and bolts of who gets those contracts and who works on those contracts, while the plan itself, the distribution itself, sought to be equitable, the result of who gets hired and the contractors get paid, that, in our memory, has been far from equitable. So wrestling with this COVID recovery money, rescue grant, how do you wrestle with that issue of equity? And it sort of goes back to the census tract, and when you put the park next to the impoverished area, but it will be largely for the benefit of the wealthy area. So it's a question of what is equity. So
That is a good question.
let me interrupt myself.
Okay, sure, keep it coming. These are great questions.
I'm noted for that. Okay.
Yeah.
Here's the point. This money is going to be here, and it's going to be gone before we really get to wrestle with the larger issues. So I guess my point is that I hope we face them going into it, because by the time it is litigated, the money will be gone. Okay? So you can give it to the large contracting firms, but that's not going to impact workers in Harrisburg. They come largely from out of the city. Okay? So while infrastructure might look equitable, it is not. So I want to just voice my opinion that
No, this
as
is,
far as this money is concerned, it's meant for the city of Harrisburg. There should be an equitable distribution across the population, the segments of the population in Harrisburg.
If I could just piggyback on that.
yeah,
We do have minorities in this city that will be looked upon to do some of the services here. No one's coming from out of state, we have people in our community from Harrisburg who are contractors that could do the work. And they're certified.
these are great questions. And I think there's two different ways that this money, that the federal government intended this money to respond to inequities. The first is that a lot of this money is for the general use of the entire city. And so, for example, let's just say COVID testing. Okay, it's a very clean example, not controversial in any way. But to the extent that people, residents of the city of Harrisburg, are struggling with cases of COVID and want to get COVID testing, and to the extent that to some degree those who are less wealthy or otherwise disadvantaged suffer disproportionately from COVID cases, the ability of the city to offer free COVID testing benefits everyone, but it especially benefits whatever groups might have been disproportionately hit by COVID cases. So some things are for the benefit of the whole city, and that might particularly help disadvantaged portions of the city. But it's intended for everyone. There's other parts of this money that go to specific groups. So for example, if the city of Harrisburg decides to do a small business grant program, and it wants to give money to small businesses, the qualifications for that talk about businesses that were impacted by the pandemic. So if small businesses as a group were particularly impacted, the grant money that you would give out, you would be checking to find out, were you impacted by the pandemic? Did you lose revenue? Did you have to fire people? All of those things. So that's an example where it would be targeted assistance. We had talked also about other examples. Let me see if I can pull a good one of childcare, for example. Childcare. I'm picking an example that we haven't talked about, just to keep throwing out new words here.
Or elder care.
Okay, but I'm going to go with childcare because I see it here from the federal government. So I'm on firm ground with this one. So childcare is in this category called impacted households. That means low and moderate income. So if you wanted to do a childcare program, you specifically cannot give it to wealthy residents of the city. You have to verify that they're low or moderate income or that they meet the other requirements. There's other ways to get to be in that bucket. But so the way the federal government set up this money is that some of it's for everybody. The revenue loss money, the premium pay money, the infrastructure, that's general. The public health, some of it's for everybody, but some of it's for impacted households or impacted communities. And they did that. They talk a lot about that in the final rule, that the reason they did that is that low income and other types of communities got especially hard hit because of COVID. Hard hit with health and hard hit with finances. And so that's why some of this money, you can only give it to impacted or disproportionately impacted.
Can I give you an example of work we did last year? And it goes right to your question about where the money's really going. In the CARES Act funding, which was 2020, one of our clients set up a small business grant program. It had a minimum. If you qualified, you got a minimum of X dollars. If you had over so many employees, you got so many dollars per employee. We worked with that entity to make sure that the rules were set up, the eligibility rules were set up, so that a business on the other side of, I can't name the name of the road, but there was a road. On the other side of the road was not their jurisdiction, and on this side there was. We went so far as to look on Google Maps, every application, to make sure they were in the city. Second thing is, and we saw very quickly that there were some businesses that were basically just empty warehouses. And those dollars were going to end up going to some hedge fund guy in New York to pay his mortgage. So we worked with that entity to basically say real estate holding companies are not eligible. So the city is really in the driver's seat here. And its preferences and its rules and its needs are really what drive this.
Question, what if you have something regarding health like a dental clinic in a community that's within the census tract, but residents from outside the census tract come in to benefit from it? Would that have to be audited very specifically to make sure it doesn't benefit those residents as well?
No, for a small business grant program, you can give to any small business grants, any small businesses. It doesn't have to be in a disproportionately.
No, I'm not into a small business.
Oh.
On the health portion of it.
Oh, health
Say-
portion.
Say if the mayor wanted to do a dental clinic or a vision clinic for a community within the census tract, that's related to health. But what if people within the outside the census tract coming to benefit from that dental or vision clinic? Would that have to be audited by the city carefully to ensure the residents coming to benefit from those clinics?
I'm pretty sure that would be fine. I would, before I would give a final answer to that, I would go back and read that section super carefully. But I think that would be fine. Off the top of my head, I'm not going to swear to it.
I have a question about some of the programs that I think, after reading the act itself, we, within the city of Harrisburg, looking at it from a youth perspective, would be able to use that to set up additional youth programs within this community, whether it were internship programs for our youth. We talked about a little bit about mental health care, but we'd be able to set up programs within the schools or give funding to the schools to set up programs to help our children. Because when we look at what's happened over the last 2 years, they have been drastically affected by being in the houses, and mental health is real. And it's something that I think we really need to hone in on with our children within this community. We talked a little bit early on, I came in and tell about in terms of guns and things like that, but we could probably take this money and shape it around programs that would benefit our kids.
Yes.
Specifically, right?
Yes,
I think
both.
that to the schools, there's a monitoring process set up to ensure that the children are getting what they need.
Yes.
Whether, I know you talked a little bit about tutoring, but I'm talking about like apprenticeship programs and internship programs.
Yes.
A jump start to be able to move in the right direction.
Job training, assistance to people who are unemployed or underemployed is a specifically eligible category, and youth job training programs would qualify under that. So yes, that's a whole, and again, we would want to, for a big program like that, you would certainly want to, read very carefully exactly all the language that relates to it, but certainly job training is an eligible category.
And that's not based on income, but if you decided one of your children could apply to the adults that have lost their jobs from a job training program?
Yes, yes. People who lost their jobs are eligible for employment services and job training programs. Did you have a question? Was your hand up?
Yeah, I just
Oh,
want to
sorry.
make a statement, and I know all of the city officials know this. Even though Capital Regional Water is a separate entity, Capital Regional Water does not have its own money. It gets grants and other things, but its money is mainly my money.
Well, I think we should give you the whole $47 million then. There we go. That would just cut this meeting right short.
Okay, you heard that.
These are important questions to bounce off of what you just said about the schools and money to the schools. Does the Harrisburg School District have a separate allocation or consideration relative to this American Rescue Plan money? That's part one. Part two, our parking authority is analogous to a New York holding company, okay? Are they going to be able to dip into the municipal funds, or are they off the table altogether, or do they go seek their own funding from the rescue plan? So, two questions. One,
Yep, got it.
school district
Yep.
parking, okay.
So the answer to the first question is not out of the state and local, the SLFRF money. So the American Rescue Plan had money for lots of stuff. I don't know if you remember, there was these $1,400 checks that were being handed out. That was, for some people, okay, so that was part of it, right? And there was also money that went to other things. There was a restaurant revitalization fund. There was money for schools. Part of that money was to go to states, counties, cities, and towns. That's the state and local fiscal recovery fund. That's what we're talking about. That's what this is a part of. So, and the schools did not get money out of that. The schools got money out of another part of the American Rescue Plan, not the state and local piece. So, yes, they got money, and no, they're not in the same category as the state and local. I don't,
In terms of time, yeah, I would echo what Julie says, is that, we talked about $2 trillion worth of American Rescue Plan and then $350 million of state and local fiscal recovery.
Billion.
Julie's absolutely dead on that schools and others, and hospitals, et cetera, got money out of that $2 trillion. On the parking authority, that's a tough question, and I really am interested to talk to you about your comment that it's analogous to a holding company. I'd like to hear more about that. But, again, that's a revenue loss issue. I mean, I have a client that is actively looking at mitigating the revenue loss, because make no doubt about it, they had significant revenue losses in parking authorities all over the Commonwealth.
yeah.
But your situation, I know to be very different than most every other municipality in the Commonwealth.
One of the eligible uses that is definitely eligible is giving money to what they call subrecipients. The city is called a recipient, meaning the federal government said, here's $47 million. There are subrecipients, meaning the city can take that money and say, okay, parking authority, we're going to give you some money.
Bad example.
Or they could say no. I'm not saying you have to. Or you could give money to a nonprofit. For example, if you decided to address gun violence, you could give money to a nonprofit for them to address gun violence. And then they would be a subrecipient. They would have to keep records. You would have to keep track of it. They would have to tell you what they did. So you're allowed to take the money that you have and give it to other organizations, whether it's parts of the city or whether it's other nonprofits or whether it's businesses. You can give the money to others, but you have to keep track of it. You have to keep records, and they have to use it for eligible purposes. So if you gave it to a nonprofit to address gun violence, they couldn't, go out and buy jacuzzis for all their employees. They gotta do what they say they're gonna do. So I didn't know if you were saying you wanted money to go to the parking authority, but Okay.
Not me.
Yeah.
They get enough of my money.
Since you talk about sub-recipients,
Yeah.
those sub-recipients pay salaries out of that money as well for direct activities specifically. For that money that you allocate, it would be allocated to them.
You can use the money for administrative expenses is one of the eligible categories. But whether you can use it to pay salaries for already existing employees, I'd have to look at that. Honestly, I don't know off the top of my head.
Is there a limit on the administrative part? 10%?
There's no quantitative limit.
Okay.
There are certain conflict of interest guidelines and a few conflict of interest restrictions. So if you're going to give, if you wanted to have a big program to, I don't know, do something, and it's going to be a lot of money, you're encouraged to have a competitive bidding process and have it be a transparent process as to how you pick it. And I think that was something that you were addressing also in terms of if folks are going to come in to do a building program, for example, how do they get picked? The final rule encourages you to have a transparent process for large projects. But there's a few restrictions, but there's no specific percentage of the administrative limits.
I understand the money is here primarily to Harrisburg, but has there been any discussions or any advantages to doing anything on a regional basis? For example, healthcare, our providers are generally regional in nature. So are there any discussions about that, any plans of any joint efforts? And is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I think it's a great question. To clarify, everybody got money, not just the city of Harrisburg. So the state got money, the county got money, all the cities got money, all the towns got money. And what you said is a great point, that if you're going to do something, it might be more effective on a regional basis. I personally don't know what conversations have been had with others or that might, but I think it's a good idea. Anybody else? I think these were some great questions. And I think I want to thank the mayor again, not just for inviting us, but for inviting you all to come with your questions and your ideas and what's important to you. And I think you're going to have a great conversation as a city about what to do with this opportunity.
I think Tom mentioned it earlier about all the clients that you've had for this. The city of Harrisburg is the first one that has actually opened it up to the public to ask for their opinions and so I want to kind of compliment what you said to the mayor, to the city council, to give the opportunity to the people to be heard, which doesn't always happen. So I think they're making great strides in trying to make that a big point, and congratulations to everybody.
So, to that point as a follow-on, I know I personally need to sort of Google over things, and figure this out a little bit more, and I'd love to see recordings of your subsequent meetings with other people, right? Is the city gonna have a website where, people who could not make these meetings, or people who, are only listening to the recordings, could offer their comments and, thoughts and suggestions where this document, for instance, would be posted? Is that gonna be something?
Yes, I can
Yes?
answer that, yeah.
Okay.
Right now, we're actually doing live stream right now on Facebook and Channel 20. And they're actually posting questions as we speak.
Okay.
We are sending the questions to the NW Financial Group so that they can answer them for them. And we can post that as well. I'm not sure if this is posted as of yet, but it will be tomorrow.
So, because I think, we have to find a neighbor tonight who can't be here, or didn't know about this, or whatever, to comment, right?
And that's a great thought. And you all and your friends and neighbors are invited to send in questions or comments. They can either be I wish we could do this, is it eligible, and we can get you an answer. Or it could be, I don't understand this, can you please explain it, or whatever. I mean, whatever type of feedback, but that would be a way to continue the conversation online. So we would be glad to work with that, yeah.
So to ask questions, do the public go to you or do they go to the city? And what is the contact information for them to do that?
There was a website. I have not seen, it was on the thing that was posted, that listed all the days and times.
Gina, you have a copy of the posting? That is on our, I did not bring a copy of the posting with all the different dates, but it is on our, what am I trying to say?
It's on Carolina, it's on Fox.
It's on everything, because city council did an excellent job of getting the information out during our meetings. And Melissa is our social media person, and she put it out everywhere. So the information is out there for the dates and times in different places. However, the one that we had scheduled for yesterday got rescheduled to the 22nd at the Boys and Girls Club at 17th and Hanover.
So I found a piece
Found
of
it.
paper. All right, the email address is communications@harrisburgpa.gov. That's communications@harrisburgpa.gov.
And they can submit their questions every day up until 4 p.m. of the date of the meeting.
The remaining meetings are tomorrow from 5:30 to 7:30 at Allison Hill Center at 1524 Walnut Street. You just said February 22nd. Can you tell the time and place?
Same time,
Same time? Okay, here at the Boys Club?
Boys and Girls Club at 17th and Hanover.
Okay, so February 22nd at the Boys and Girls Club at 17th and Hanover Street. February 23rd at HMAC at 1110 North 3rd Street. And February 24th at the Nativity School of Harrisburg at 2101 North 5th Street.
And HMAC, known to the people in Harrisburg, HMAC.
Sorry. Sorry. I know. Okay. Yes.
You indicated in addition to the city getting money, the county is going to be getting money. Harrisburg is in the county, sometimes I don't think they realize that, but it is in the county. And will they be working with the city as to what they give in the city, or are they gonna hand it out from the county?
Actually, I'm gonna let the mayor speak about that because she had a meeting with the commissioners.
Work together to negotiate what we're gonna do and collaborate, how we're gonna spend the money. But they are willing to, because Harrisburg, not only the city, inside the county area, they have to be careful that they do it divided equally.
But to clarify, the city's money came directly from the federal government and does not come through the state and does not come through the county. It's a direct deposit from the White House itself. Yes?
So they would be, the city from the Dalton County would be the sub.
No, these
city
are
got-
all separate recipients.
Yeah,
The county is a recipient, the state is a recipient, the city of Harrisburg is a recipient, the
School
township
district.
of Berwyn is a recipient.
Easttown Township, yes.
Yes, so, when I was talking about subrecipients, that's if, for example, you give money to a nonprofit to provide services on your behalf. But in terms of getting the money, well, the little towns got it through the state, but the big cities got it directly from
Federal
the
government.
Department of Treasury.
Yeah, I just want to make sure we get our fair share from the county.
I'm not gonna say what the county will do, and I'm not gonna say what the county should do. It is not obligated to give any money to the city of Harrisburg. The county's money is its money to do with it as it decides. So I make no statement about what should happen, but what it, I don't know. But you can look it up, it's on the federal website.
How much?
Yeah, hi, Wes Majors, Harrisburg City Council. So as we know from this meeting, the city of Harrisburg received $47 million. The county of Dalton will receive $54 million. So as, in terms of the overall spend, the city has gotten, the city just ourselves has $47 million. The county, which is over 180,000, roughly about 180,000 people, has $54 million. I think there might be opportunities to partner with the county on certain projects within the city, but the city itself has $47 million to allocate on different projects.
That's correct.
Could be partnerships, as the mayor mentioned, but I think
Right.
we have a lot better way to forge our own path with the $47 million we are receiving.
Absolutely right, thank you. And but I just wanted to be clear that the county money isn't to be
They're not
divided
obligated.
specifically among the constituents. It's, yeah.
Is there anywhere where you can go in and find out where in Pennsylvania,
Yes.
where every municipality, city, blah, blah, blah?
Yes.
blah?
It's public record. There's a website. It's on the Department of Treasury's website. And if you send in a question to communications@harrisburgpa.gov, I will send you back the link to where you can look that up. I can also answer for you what anybody got. The entire United States, it's all public knowledge. So it's, and it's actually surprisingly easy to use. It's not so bad. I mean, as these things go, there's some things that are kind of a nightmare, but that particular, you can just go into their website and hit search and put somebody's name in it and just pops right up. Would any of the young people like to say anything? I'm so glad you're here. It's wonderful that you're listening to all of this.
Are you saying I'm not young?
Do you folks have anything you want to say? Any questions? If you have any ideas about what would be a good way to help the city, I encourage you to speak to your mayor or your council folks that are
To
here.
their father.
Or to their father, or anybody who's here. Because, you guys are going to be in the city for a while, so maybe you have some ideas about good ways to help out. Okay.
Anna, what would you like to see in the city? Everything shots.
That's okay. We're just glad you're here. Thank you for coming.
Since they were born, they born.
Any of our other council members would like to say anything?
Thanks for coming out.
Okay, well, that wraps up public meeting number 1. 4 more to go. Thank you, guys, and hopefully